It's another beautiful day, so let's go on a pod walk together about solving problems. And this pod walk is the second in a mini-series of pod walks where I'm sharing a little constellation of beliefs, which I think are what lies behind my somewhat surprising focus, motivation and determination to become a singer-songwriter. I mean, quite frankly, I'm pretty surprised that even despite all of the difficulties I've got going on here at home, I still seem to be very motivated and excited to do it, even though I'm struggling to sing well and I'm struggling to find the time. So if you haven't listened to the previous PodWalk, it'll be the previous podcast on the Monday Land feed. Please do that before listening to this one, because in that one I explain why I'm doing this and what the first belief was. But the second belief, which in fact is another facet of the first one, in fact all three of the beliefs are different facets of the same belief, but it's got a different emphasis. And the second belief is I could solve any problem. Now what I mean by I could solve any problem is in fact pretty universal. I do mean any problem, but for the purposes of the pod walk today, let's just focus on the studio. So let's say the belief is I could solve any problem in my music. Now, there are a few things that this doesn't mean. This doesn't mean, for instance, that your music can instantly become as brilliant as your musical hero, because that happening would defy the laws of physics. This is a very important part of the belief. I could solve any problem as long as it doesn't defy the laws of physics, would be the full way of saying it. It also doesn't mean, so you'll notice the words are chosen very carefully, it doesn't mean I will solve every problem. So in other words, it doesn't mean that, let's say you're working on a piece of music, it doesn't mean that you can make that piece of music into the greatest track ever written. Because that would require that you, number one, knew what all the problems were that stood between this piece of music and the greatest track ever written. And you would have to be certain that you will solve all the problems. The belief is a much lower bar than that. I could solve any problem in my music. Okay, so in other words, when I come up against problems in my music, I could solve them, and if not solve them right now, find a way around them, which you will notice is in itself a solution. Now, the amazing thing about this belief is it seems fairly innocuous. It doesn't seem like it would have that much of an impact. But what I've found is that by really taking this belief on and reminding myself on it time and time again, so many of the problems that I have faced in the past in terms of improving my music and practicing and moving forward are no longer there. So what I want to do now is go through what believing the opposite, believing that you couldn't solve any problem in your music, actually does. And you will probably notice that many of the problems that you face come directly as a result of not believing that you could solve any problem. So for example, what if you didn't believe that you could solve any problem in your music? What does it stop you doing? Well, it stops you even starting to do something that you want to do. Great example in my case is singing and songwriting. Because I didn't believe I could solve any problem in my music to become a great singer-songwriter, it took me until the age of 50 to get started. I thought I was past it. I thought it wasn't going to be possible for me to get as good as I wanted to get because I didn't believe I could solve any problem in my music. Now I do believe I can solve any problem in my music and have made it explicit. It allows me to do something which might seem to be very difficult. To learn how to sing, not as a choir boy, but much more purposefully than that, and to write songs. Another example is in many of the people who I help. When I ask them if they want to make an album, they will say, well, I would love to make an album, but I don't have time, or I don't have the focus, or I can't hit deadlines, or I don't have the gear. If you believed that you could solve any problem in your music, or in fact, in your life which would allow you to make that album, then you would do the thing that you wanted. So not believing you could solve any problem is in fact the first obstacle that stops you doing anything at all. And then if you don't believe you could solve any problem, what we often end up doing, we attempt to avoid problems in our music, right? So a great example of this is learning to do before doing to learn. So in other words, instead of getting your hands dirty and just making music and learning on the job, which I can guarantee you're going to have to do anyway, what you end up doing if you don't think you can solve problems is you end up getting completely and utterly overwhelmed with things like YouTube tutorials. And you start learning about making music and forget to actually make music. Whereas when you believe that you could solve any problem, you do first. I mean, it's natural. Well, if I can solve any problem, I'm just going to get on with it. I'm just going to start making music and I'm going to learn from that doing. I'm going to problem solve. I'm going to create knowledge by actually doing the thing. And I will only look for information when I need it. And in my experience, that's very rarely. So you save a lot of time as well. Something else that not believing that you could solve any problem does is it makes us too careful. It stops us from taking risks in our music. We start making generic music. It turns us more towards the craft side of things and away from the art, because you're not sure you can solve the problems. Instead of being free to do what you want, to take any risk at any point, you don't push beyond your limits. You don't try stuff. You are much less experimental. You're much more careful and safe. And I'm sure you've had the experience of making a track, coming up with an idea and absolutely loving it, thinking it's brilliant, and then getting afraid of that idea, becoming afraid of working on it because you don't want to ruin it. And then what happens is you end up procrastinating and listening to it and listening to it and listening to it more, over listening to it, getting bored of it, and then it's never finished. If you've ever had that experience, have a think about it right now. What would you have done differently if you were sure you could solve any problem? If you were sure you could solve any problem in that piece, even if you did ruin it, because you were sure you could solve any problem, you would do it anyway, because you recognized that moving forward might mean ruining it, but you can make it better. So if you've ever got afraid of ruining a great idea, it just might be because you don't believe you could solve any problem. Another example of not believing this is when we work on the easy things that we're certain that we can fix, instead of working on the important things that we are uncertain we can fix. A really great example. Let's say you're towards the start of making a piece of music and you're working on it in a loop. What you end up doing is you end up making that loop, that 8 or 16 bar loop, sound absolutely incredible instead of arranging it. And then the longer you leave it in that loop, the harder and harder it becomes to arrange, until the point you literally can't arrange it. It's become concrete. You've got a terrible case of loopitis. Loopitis is as a result of not believing that you could solve any problem. Because at any given stage of the creative process, there is always a most important next step to take. And very often, not always, but very often, that most important next step isn't the one that we're sure that we can solve. Great example for me in writing songs recently was that I had a chorus that I just knew wasn't working. And I found myself procrastinating, fiddling around with almost everything else instead of rewriting the chorus. And then when I reminded myself, actually, I can solve any problem, I instantly got on with the most important thing. I mean, what on earth is the point of fiddling around with a hi-hat when I've got to rewrite the chorus? New lyrics, new melody, right? Doesn't make any sense at all. Why would I be futzing around with a hi-hat? The reason is because I was certain that I could fix the hi-hat problem, but was uncertain that I could solve the chorus problem. If I knew I could solve any problem, then I would always be focused on the most important thing rather than futzing around with the small details which aren't important yet. Because of course, I'm not saying we don't focus on detail, because at some point, those details do become the most important problem. What this belief does is it allows us to focus on things that make us feel uncertain, which are very often the most important things that could mean the difference between this music being great and not finished. Another example of not believing you could solve any problem is it creates analysis paralysis. Because what you end up doing is you end up trying to find the perfect solution to this problem. If you've ever scrolled through thousands of presets, or if you've ever tried 10 or more options on something, this is often because you're trying to make it perfect, completely fix the problem in this moment now, trying to choose the perfect solution between all of those different options, instead of going with something that is imperfect, that may well be progress, but which doesn't necessarily solve all the problems, because this is an absolutely essential thing to understand about problems. There is no state in which you will have solved all of the problems, because that is perfection. And we cannot achieve perfection. And even if we could, we wouldn't know we had. There are always problems, and solving one problem always creates another. But I'm going to stop it here because we're starting to get onto the territory of the next belief, which I'm going to share in the next PodWalk. But for now, get a pen and a piece of paper, or you could do it in a note, and write down, I could solve any problem. Now, what I want you to do is have a think through, if you believed that, what would you do differently? Have a think through on a paper or in a doc, like write what you would do differently. What would you do differently in terms of starting things? What would you do differently in terms of in the process? How would you approach your sessions differently? What pieces of music might you choose to work on and not choose to work on? What would change about your process? What would you stop doing? What would you do less of? Because I can promise you, when you look at this belief, I could solve any problem, you will notice that its inverse, not believing that, lies behind many of the obstacles, much of the procrastination, much of the overwhelm, much of the confusion that you face in your creative process. And if you found this useful, make sure that you subscribe to the Mondayland podcast, and also share it with someone who might find it useful as well. Until next time, onwards and upwards.